the world's changing. The climate's changing. No duh, right? Geologists are now referring to the era in which we now live, the Anthropocene, because of humanity's dramatic impact on the globe on which we live. Um, I think people have understood humanity's effects on the world and have worked to protect it for at least 100 years, right? And I think in this video, I want to highlight a few trends of the last 100, 200 years that are going to be important and tie into subjects we're going to look at in the future about this age of the Anthropocene. One is the decline in the amount of forest cover around the world, and relatedly, two, the growth in agricultural production in a lot of this deforested land. And it's going to link into a couple of topics I'm going to mention briefly at the end of this video. Resource depletion. Forestry and trees are a resource to generate oxygen, to build our IKEA furniture, right? A lot of different things that we use the forests for, and it is a finite resource. Like a lot of the other resources we're going to be looking at in this class. So how do we try to understand what the effects are for depleting the resources, as well as how there's been an uptick in renewable resources, solar power being one that we're going to get touched on in a second. So forest cover has gone down, agricultural production has gone up, and the nature of agricultural production has changed quite dramatically in the last 50 years. And so there's been a lot of efforts to try to protect the forests and other resources around the world for at least the last couple 100 years. Let's see if I can figure this out. Here we go. Okay. And so for me, my first exposure to the efforts at preserving the natural resources that we depend on for both enjoyment as well as for the sustainability of the human race is Yosemite National Park. It was not actually the first national park within the United States, or actually in the world. The first effort at, the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans had areas that they put aside for both urban and rural parks and groves, some tied to religion. Back in the 18th century, in 1783, the Qing dynasty declared Mongolia's Bogkhan Mountain a protected site. There's been other holy mountains that have also been protected around the world, going back much farther than the 19th century. In the United States, where I'm from, the first effort at trying to protect a resource area was actually in Arkansas. Hot Springs, Arkansas became the first U.S. national reservation in 1832. The first official U.S. national park was Yellowstone National Park in 1872. Never actually have been to Yosemite. I want to get to Yosemite and Glacier National Park in Montana, because Glacier National Park, supposedly within the next 20 years or so, is no longer going to have any active glaciers within it. There's been quite dramatic change in a lot of parks around the world. Yellowstone was the first national park in the United States. Royal National Park in New South Wales was established by the New South Wales Premier in 1879. It's grown since then. Absolutely one of the favorite parts for the 2 years that I lived in Sydney was going on the train down to Sutherland and the entrance to a Royal National Park. Absolutely gorgeous area if you haven't been. In Europe, in 1909, Sweden created its first, Europe's first national park, the Sarek National Park. So the efforts of trying to protect at least some parts of the natural world has gone back quite a long time. The first efforts to try to coordinate public opinion and efforts to try to protect natural resource endowments and the natural world. First Earth Day was over 50 years ago in 1970. There have been a couple of major international conferences Stockholm in 1972, Rio in 1992. There's been other ones since 1992. After this video, I'm going to encourage you to take a look at a couple of brief videos about the Stockholm and Rio conference to kind of see how the rhetoric has stayed and the awareness of the issue has stayed relatively constant for quite a long time. But so in this picture that we've been staring at, President Teddy Roosevelt was visiting Yosemite with John Muir, one of the early advocates of the national world before the Yosemite National Park was actually declared. Despite this, Yosemite and other national parks, and I mentioned Glacier National Park earlier, are not necessarily protected from the other impacts of human activity. You might protect an area from logging, but that doesn't mean that global warming, weather changes aren't also having an effect. And so this picture was from a relatively small fire near Yosemite. The picture that I had at the start of this video was in Paradise, California, a couple of years ago. A huge fire that led to the deaths of over 100 people in a small town not a half an hour away from my family in Orville, California. And we got quite harrowing reports of how the fire was progressing in Paradise a couple of years ago, similar to our experience here in Canberra. We had family reaching out to us as the fires seemed to creep closer to Canberra. So there's been a creation of a lot of efforts to protect. However, not all of these efforts can necessarily hermetically seal off these areas from the other effects of human activity. A couple of trends to try to help us grasp the scope and the extent of the change that the human world has seen over the last let's say 50 years is going to be our focus today, but you could look at these figures from a study looking back a lot further. There's really fascinating quantitative historians looking at economic production related to a couple of weeks ago, but in forest cover, this recent study looked at how much of Central Europe was covered in forest in 900 AD to 1900 AD. You see the black areas become much more scarce as human activity has expanded. As the populations have expanded, economic production has expanded. More people need more goods. We all need to eat, and we all need a place to live, and that's encroached on a lot of these natural areas. We're going to be talking about the Arctic, Antarctic, and other places that we're seeing, Siberia, that have been affected by human change. However, I think it's also important to recognize what transformation has occurred in developed countries. In Australia, in Europe, in the UK, in the United States, these changes that we often see people critiquing in Brazil with the Amazon forest, in Indonesia, in Borneo and Papua, you see efforts to try to protect resources in areas in which the changes have already happened in a lot of the developed world. A couple of graphs to kind of show you the magnitude of this change just within the last 30 years or so. These graphs are from the World Bank's World Development Indicators. My university, when I went to grad school, they only subscribed to the World Development Indicators by a CD, so I had to go into the library, load the CD into a computer, and to be able to look at these data. Now you have these wonderful visuals for a whole bunch of different indicators. So you see forest area as a percentage of land area in the world has gone down from 1990 to 2016. So there's been this overall decline in the amount of forest area. Different countries have different resource bases. So Australia, we see, is more forested than the United Kingdom, though that is ticking down a bit. New Zealand actually saw an uptick in recent years slightly. It's harder to see in this more aggregate graph. But if you look at land area forest as a percentage of land area, it shows you how the U.S. and New Zealand might be above the world average, Australia and the U.K. Below it. But if you look at it from just an absolute value of the square kilometers, you see that Australia is higher than New Zealand, and the U.S., also a large country, has it. Trying to reinforce the importance of looking at measures, whether it's relative to some kind of base like GDP or geographical size, or just absolute value, is an ongoing refrain that we're going to see over the course of this semester, that how you measure things, whether it's relative or absolute, can lead you to different conclusions. As the number of forested areas have declined, you might be surprised to see that the arable land per person around the world has gone down also quite dramatically over this same time period. So we're going to look at how deforestation has led to increased area of land for agricultural production, but the pace of population growth has outpaced that. So arable land as a percentage of the number of people in the world has actually gone down, and the population is growing quite dramatically. There's some discussion about how population growth would outpace resources has been an issue since Malthus in the 19th century, and we're going to look at this in the population discussion next week, I believe. But there's also literature that suggests that in developed countries the population growth has shrunk, in some cases too much. I think Russia had a national holiday to try to encourage more babies being born. Japan has had an issue with an aging population, Germany, other developed countries. So there is population slowing in certain areas, and some estimates suggest that the population growth trend, you see this relatively constant line, is actually going to level off and potentially decline by the end of this century. But right now, the global population is growing quite consistently, and Malthus, Thanos had a kind of extreme reaction to population growth, but you can see overall that there has been quite dramatic growth, and it's occurring in both developing and developed countries, with the United States being less natural population growth within the country because of the growth of immigration within the country until quite recently. So you see population growth change depending on what country you're actually looking at. What's also striking when you look at population and link it to these larger trends of forest land land use and the deforestation for being able to produce goods and give people a place to live, is that there's fewer and fewer people tilling this arable land. Fewer people are actually working on the land. This is a historical trend graph from Max Rosser, plotted in Our World in Data, which also is another place to visualize a lot of these trends, that in the developed world, there's been a huge decrease in the number of people working in agriculture in the labor force. So this has gone from above 60% in a number of countries to 1 to 3%, depending on what country you're actually looking at. So the number of people working has gotten less, and in the world itself, less than 50% are actually working in agriculture. You see in Australia, it's gone down below 5%, which is higher than some countries, but lower than the world average. And you can see around the world the darker colors in blue in this map. There's a lot of missing data, but you see India and China having higher levels of people working in agriculture. In West Africa, one thing we're going to be looking at later on in this semester is in sub-Saharan Africa. You have a huge reliance on rain-fed agriculture. In a lot of countries, a vast majority of people work in agriculture. In Burundi, over 90% work in agriculture, and 95% of the agricultural land in sub-Saharan Africa is not irrigated. So people are working on the land, and they're susceptible to weather changes and unpredictable weather patterns that could make it harder to actually produce. But you see here, like with a lot of different metrics that we've looked at in this class, it tells a deeper truth that there is regional differences between who works on the land and who doesn't, and how quickly this change has happened in certain areas, and in even developing areas in the last 20 or 30 years. There's been a huge exodus of people, as we'll see in the next couple of weeks, from rural areas to urban areas, to moving away from agriculture to working in other roles. This is not to say that the direction can't change. This graph, I thought, is noticeable. Is of notice in the United States, that you had the percentage of people in the labor force in agriculture increase quite dramatically, often because of population growth in the U.S. until roughly the turn of the 20th century, and then you saw quite a dramatic decline and then an averaging off, but as a percentage of the labor force, it also went down. And yeah, this can change. In Burundi, actually, the percentage of people working in agriculture has ticked up a bit just since 2014 because of the uncertainty and instability because of the 2015 election that we touched on last week. Tying it to here in Australia, you see the number of people. Currently, the percentage in Australia working in agriculture is 3%, down from 5.5% in 1991. I don't know how many of you are familiar with 417 visas. This is the temporary work visas that a lot of agricultural producers in Australia depend on for backpackers to go pick produce. From July, I looked at the most recent report from Home Affairs. From July to December 2019, almost 105,000 working holidaymaker visas were issued. So over 100,000 people coming in for short periods of time, up to a year. The last I heard, you can only work 88 days in a particular job before moving on, but that number is down 9% from the previous year. And with the current coronavirus lockdown on international movement, you see press reports about people finding it difficult to find migrant labor to pick some of the agricultural produce. There's a really interesting New York Times article, I can link to it on Waddle, about the difficulty picking cherries in the American Northwest. Cherries are produce fruit that has to be picked by hand. There's no machinery that can really handle the delicate fruit, and how a lot of the producers are finding it hard to actually find people to pick. You have fruit rotting in the fields because there aren't enough people to actually produce and pick things because of the time-sensitive nature to it. And kind of connecting the two trends of population growth and arable land usage, I thought these two figures from mainland China show the clustering of people along the east coast, as well as the clustering of arable land along the eastern seaboard. And also, I think what's interesting and relevant to note is just how, with population density increasing, a lot of the areas. I was in Shenzhen over 20 years ago now, and there's places where I came from the south that I haven't been to this area since, but that you had agricultural production in areas quite close to Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, that have now undoubtedly been transformed into urban areas because of population growth and development. So you have an increased displacement of agricultural land production, and so an increasing reliance on other sources, either within the country or from abroad, to produce some of the essentials that all of us depend on. China is also another interesting case because of its sheer size and scale of its development since 1986, that there has been growing pains that have just been incredibly large in absolute size, as well as relative to some other issues. So pollution is something you can see from space. I think in one of my later lectures, I will show pollution blowing into the Korean Peninsula from the Chinese mainland. But resource depletion has been an issue in China that has received a lot more policy efforts to try to reverse in recent years. 60% of the underground water is polluted. Air and water pollution is estimated to cost between 3 to 6% of GDP as of a little over a decade ago. The environment is the costs, resource and environmental costs related to this depletion is also huge, estimated to cost around 13% of GDP as of 15 years ago. And air pollution contributes to 1.2 premature deaths in China as of about a decade ago. So through this huge change in the size and scale of human involvement in different areas around the world, there's been societal costs from an environmental standpoint with resource depletion, health and human security effects of this. But this Chinese case can also show how policy can also have an effect. This graph shows the growth in photovoltaic solar panel installations around the world, and China has made a really large investment in trying to become both producers of panels as well as installing them around the country. The bit in red in 2015, this is the most recent graph that I could see that dramatically shows China's contribution. But in the last 5 years, they've both been able to produce large amounts of panels as well as install them. Efforts at trying to install them has been roughly almost a third of all installations are occurring in China. Germany, we're going to be touching on this later on, has also made large commitments to solar installations, as the graph in the bottom shows the growth of installations. And there's another article that I read recently, I can post it in Waddle as well, that showed that this is an unalloyed benefit for the reduction in dependence on coal-fired power plants and other sources of energy generation, because solar resources are renewable. However, there's an unanticipated consequence in the sheer number of panels being installed. There really hasn't been any policy efforts at figuring out what to do with all the panels when they reach their end of useful life. And so there's a call to action to try to figure out how we're going to be able to handle all these panels once they get replaced or they stop working or they break in storms. So these are just a brief couple of examples that highlight some of the issues we're going to be touching on in the second part of the class. The unsustainable amount of reduction and depletion of resources in the environment, and the growth in production, but also efficiencies that can lead to much less people having to work on the land, as well as policy efforts to try to shift the reliance on non-renewable resources and move it towards renewable. And we're going to link it in a later section at looking at the effects on human security and conflict specifically. And so this leads me to the first lecture question that I wanted to get your perspectives on, and that is, what do you think this decline in agricultural work or resource depletion has on civil conflict? Both have outside reasons for it, as well as policy reasons. What effect do you think this has, given your knowledge of the causes of conflict we talked about over the last couple of weeks? What effect do you think these structural changes have, resource depletion and agricultural employment, has on the risk of conflict? You can answer those on Waddle, and I will leave you to do that, as well as a couple of videos of time lapses looking at from a larger scale how viscerally and real these changes are.